Good afternoon, everyone. I hope your day is going well. Thanks so much for joining us to talk about 6 ways to nail your customer experience. With me today, we have Ryan Francis, LaunchPad Lab's CEO and partner, along with Brett Hileman, one of our client principals and CRO expert here at LaunchPad Lab. So today we are going to be covering CRO versus CXO versus journey optimization and the differences within them, along with 6 tips to jumpstart your efforts. We'll also show you the 4-step framework that we have been using and how to apply to a real business, along with some tech recommendations. And before we get started, for the new faces here, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to give a quick overview of LaunchPad Lab.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Like Rebecca mentioned, I'm Ryan. I'm the CEO here at LaunchPad. LaunchPad Lab has been around since 2012. We are a custom development shop headquartered in Chicago. So we work with companies looking to build new web and mobile applications. And we do a lot on the Salesforce ecosystem. We've been Salesforce partners since 2012. And a lot of our clients come to us when they are sort of looking to build something custom that's like integrated with Salesforce, or potentially just kind of, we refer to this as the dual engine architecture, but like leveraging custom software development for those customer facing experiences, partner facing experiences, leveraging Salesforce for more of your internal operations, like your sales team and support team. So we really like to help our clients more holistically across all of those things. But our bread and butter is really helping our clients to build like new innovative products. We've got a team of about 45 people at this point, mostly engineers, designers, product strategists. That's kind of the gist. So I'm really excited to dig in a bit today with Brett on this subject, which is like really important to us, which is all about customer experience. How do we hone that experience? It's a lot of what we do. And I think Brett has a lot of good insights to share today.
Cool. Yeah, well, thanks, Ryan. I wanted to kind of start by framing our conversation around some terms that get thrown around a lot within optimization. I think it's important to kind of understand these approaches and clearly define them within your company. I find that companies naturally want to optimize. It's natural to have some things out there and you want to optimize them. But I find if it's not formalized, if you don't have a defined approach, a lot of times it'll go unnoticed or it'll die off really quick. So I think it's helpful to just like understand some frameworks for how to approach optimization and kind of what we do here at LaunchPad. So there's really like 3 realms that I see things falling into. These are very loose terms. What CRO means to someone could mean something totally different to another. So keep that in mind. But how I think about it is there's this big bucket called customer experience optimization, or also known as CXO. How I think about that is it's looking at the entire life cycle of a customer, from the point where they see your first ad to the point where they've been a customer for 20 years. And it's trying to get that full picture and understand where you can optimize in that experience. You'll hear a lot about big enterprise companies taking this approach. They have a big team to support that, and they have a lot of data to support it as well. Another approach that we kind of adopt here is what we call customer journey optimization. It's kind of what I see as like a fragment of CXO. And then below that is what I would say is CRO, which is more like single touch point focused. So the big difference between these is CXO is looking at everything. We're going to understand the entire journey someone goes to, that 360 view, and we're going to try to optimize as we see that. Journey optimization is saying, okay, we know our customers go through these 20 different journeys with us. Let's see if we can focus in on 1 or 2 of those that are most important to us and optimize those. So it's focusing on the journey first, then thinking of optimization. And then you have CRO, which is very like single touch point based, typically with conversions like marketing. So that could be like a landing page, right? And it's very focused on like a single page, which can be fabulous if you get that focus because you can have really big gains. But I find a lot of times you're missing the full equation of the conversion if you're focusing on a single touch point. So that's why we tend to fall in the middle, because it's manageable, but you're also taking a holistic approach to to your optimization. So I just want to lay that groundwork. I think it's helpful. So yeah, let's talk about some tips. So we've kind of established like what all these things mean. We've kind of established that like thinking through journey optimization, what are the things that you really should be thinking about as you're like planning your program at your company, or let's say you already have an optimization program, maybe it's not working too well. There's some things I've learned as I've gone through this journey that maybe I could share so you don't fall into those traps. The first one that I think is probably the most important is just leading with the highest priority business objectives. So what I mean by that is, what dial is your company trying to turn, and what is the most important thing for your company all the way up to the executive level? Understanding that first is step one in an optimization program. If you're jumping in and doing anything before this, you're probably going to be optimizing the wrong thing. I've done this personally. I've thought that I knew what an important touch point was. I went out and optimized it, and I went to the business and said, look, I increased this by 200%. Like, well, we're not seeing it in the numbers we care about. And yeah, it's hard to get buy-in to continue doing that work. So if you understand what, executive level is looking at, and you move the dial with your optimization program on those things, you're going to get buy-in. So to me, that's just step one, most important.
Brett, just to kind of jump in on this, I'd be curious to hear from you on like the different types of journeys that you tend to see, and like how, just to kind of bring that home a little bit more on like a couple of examples of journeys and like how a business might choose a certain journey.
Yeah. So, I think the most obvious journey I typically see is on like the converting side of things, like acquiring a new customer, right? That could be a single journey. It could be multiple journeys. Funnels aren't as straightforward as they used to be. But typically what I see is, on the top level, they're looking at the KPIs associated with new customer acquisition, right? Like cost to acquire a customer. And then typically when we dive in there, we're typically focusing on a journey that's from like a marketing asset to conversion. Like, I am a customer now. Typically we hone in there. It's like, when do I get first introduced to the company, and when do I actually become a customer? And that's a common journey we've seen. A lot of times we focus in on like, LTV, like lifetime value of a current customer, or like trying to get referrals from a current customer, right? Like that's typically an important objective. And then we're focusing in on like, what are the most important journeys once you're a customer, right? If you're buying a mortgage, when you go to if you're getting a mortgage, when you go to make your first payment, that's a pretty big thing, because you're going to probably set it and forget it. So that like first thing you do, like once you're a customer, is pretty important. So that's typically what I see.
Got it. No, that really helps.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So, once you understand your objective, and like I was kind of talking to Ryan about, is like, there typically are some journeys that'll surface, right? I want to focus on referrals. I know that like typically people will refer when they go through this and this thing. And then you bring those journeys to the top. And what's important at this step is look at the entire journey, and understand all the touch points and all the things that are involved from A, B to C to D, and consider the entire thing as you go in to identify your opportunities. Commonly, what I see is, people say, okay, we care about referrals, right? And the only thing we really care about within referrals is that field where they fill out the person's email, right? And they'll go in and try to optimize that. And sometimes you just won't see the effects of that in your end result, because you may have something down the line that's preventing, that whole like journey from optimizing and doing better. I see it a lot on the marketing side of things, right? Like, you optimize a landing page, but then your checkout experience has like 99% drop off, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you increase that by 400%. It's not going to affect the bottom line, and you're not going to see it in your overall objectives, right?
Yeah, no, this really resonates with me. I've definitely seen this with some clients. Like, we had a client where we redid their whole website, but we didn't touch their sort of checkout process. And The website was effective. We drove more traffic, but what we found was it didn't really move the overall needle in the way that maybe we had hoped. But once we got in and redid that checkout, and frankly, the checkout was like really bad. We actually saw their online revenue spike by like 7x. It's kind of doing both of those things together, but just doing one alone was probably not sufficient. The other thing that I know, Brett, we've seen is like situations where like a step leading up to a conversion funnel can have a big impact on that conversion funnel. Like I know even in some cases, like more steps actually have been shown to like increase conversion rate. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all on how that might impact this.
Yeah, we had one example recently. It was a warranty company. And I think we had a very like focused CRO program for them, like focusing on landing page conversion and like specific, like, the payment page. But when we like zoomed out and like thought about the entire journey, we ended up like coming up with some opportunities where we said, the hypothesis here is like, if we gather more information up front, they'll be more committed and thus convert higher. And it's kind of backwards because you're like, well, you're making it harder for them to complete the funnel. But then when we implemented it, we actually increased, I think it was like 40% or something. It was a lot. But I don't think we would have saw that if we wouldn't have zoomed out, right? We would have just kept optimizing a landing page, which is good, but it may not be your weakest link, right? So yeah, it's pretty fascinating once you zoom out and look at the whole thing. Yeah. Let's go to step 3. So we're kind of going through the flow here. We've identified our objective. We identified our journey. We're looking at the journey holistically every step along the way. And typically when you go and do that, you're going to identify some opportunities, some like pretty obvious things. You're like, well, like that's obviously probably an issue, right? And you may sit down with people in your team, you may have like an internal session and do some journey mapping, and everyone will put stickies on the board and say, we think that we can make this better, this better, and this better. Commonly what I've seen, and I've fallen in this trap before, is people will immediately go from that step to building solutions and testing. And that's a really big mistake because you're not taking into account data and research, right? And data and research is the backbone of optimization. So typically what I say is have that internal session, like have a brainstorming session, identify your opportunities, put a bunch of stickies on the board. But then go and confirm those opportunities. Look at your data, interview customers, see if they think the journey is the same as what you think it is, right? And then revisit those opportunities and say, do we still think these are good ideas? If they are, then yeah, then go ahead with the flow. But I think what you'll find, and what I've seen a lot, is we think something internally and the customer thinks something totally different. I remember one example where we did journey mapping and we said, this has like 10 steps. The customer has like 10 touch points within this flow. We went to go do some interviews, and in reality, they only thought there were like 5. And like we identified opportunities from that because we're like, oh, like they're totally missing this step. It's like really critical to this experience. So like just don't assume. I typically say assume you know nothing. Like that's what I found with testing is I thought things were just like home runs, and they were actually regressions, and they hurt our conversions. So it's always, you got to confirm via external feedback. It's just, it's a must. So yeah.
I don't really have anything else to add on that tip number 3, but I definitely have seen many instances on client projects that we've done at LaunchPad where that external feedback has provided some critical information that if we didn't have it, at a minimum, we would have had some rework on the project. At a worst case, it could have jeopardized the outcomes we were seeking to achieve. So 100% agree. I think there's like, and I know you're going to get to this in a little bit, but there's like a, definitely like a right level of that external feedback where there's an 80-20 rule with it. Let's put it that way. So I know we're going to get to that a little bit too. So.
Yeah, totally. Like that's not something you have to overthink. Right? Like sometimes it's just like sit down with a couple of customers that have gone through it and you're going to learn a ton, right? Like sometimes people overthink it. We got to do like formal focus groups and all that. And most of the times you don't need to, just pick up the phone, call a couple people, you'll learn a lot. And then like expanding on this is like tip number 4 is, so you've got your journey, you're starting to look at your external feedback. You think some opportunities. The most obvious place I see people look is at their analytics. Typically their quantitative data. So I'd be like Google Analytics is the most common one, right? You hop into Google Analytics, you look at your funnel, you see page views, you see all this stuff happening, and you just start to make some assumptions off of that, right? Like, oh, 50% are dropping off at this point, it must be this. I found if you stop there, you're going to leave a lot on the table. So I like to take it a step further, and I'll even sometimes ignore quantitative data. I think qualitative is where the real bread and butter is here. So when I say qualitative, I mean things like interviews, session recordings, just talking to people. We're all people here. We're all humans, right? Like, and this is a human experience. Best way to do it is not through numbers. The best way to do it is just like talking to each other, right? Session recordings are super easy to spin up. You can use a tool like Hotjar, Crazy Egg, and just record the session. You'll learn a lot from that. You'll see people rage clicking if something doesn't work, right? So I always say, like, just take it a bit further, and I think you'll discover a ton. So I've just fallen in that trap because quantitative is easy, right? Like, it's easy to put Google Analytics up and look at some reports, but I find you'll miss a lot. So.
Yeah, I know this resonates, and I mean there's been situations where my other company, Adult Bunk Beds, we launched a new version of our website, and I saw that the conversion rate actually dipped on it, and I was like, how did we get this wrong? This was maybe 3 years ago, and I was like, I feel like we've made so many good upgrades here. Like, how could this have gone wrong? But digging in and actually like talking to a couple customers, as well as like, frankly, the Hotjar approach, I watched some screen recordings back and we looked at what was going on. We found that people weren't finding the key part of the site, which is the place where they add the product to their cart. It was like a little bit under the fold. And that was like a tweak we made that was different than the normal e-commerce approach. And once we moved that above the fold, not only did our conversion rate catch up, it like leapt ahead. So if we had just looked at like, the conversion rate's lower, let's go back to the old website, we would have maybe missed out on a chance to get ahead just by, digging in a bit more, going beyond that quantitative data and looking at what was really going on. So this definitely resonates and had a big impact on my own business. So
yeah, that makes sense. And I think qualitative data is really great for companies that don't have a ton of traffic as well. To really like understand trends in quantitative data typically requires quite a bit of data and traffic to your website. So if you just don't have that, you could still do optimization. You just may want to rely on your qualitative stuff a bit more. So it's always a great option for that. And again, like, it doesn't have to be too complicated, right? Like, you could keep this pretty straightforward. Another great asset that I've learned a ton from is customer service. I used to go sit in our customer service department and just listen in on calls. I used to go do that like bi-weekly back when I was in banking, and just like hear customers, like hear it from them about the journeys they're going through. And it's super valuable. So like having, I always suggest, as I'm looking at like tech stacks and like what data you have available to you before you start your optimization program, I typically say, always make sure you have a great place to put your customer service information. Like, what was the tickets about? As much detail as you can get there, the better, because that'll become such a valuable resource for your optimization team. So I always try to surface that as much as I can. So, and I think this like adds to what we were just saying is like, based on my experience, this may be different for everyone, but I find that quality is typically better than quantity. I've learned a lot more from sitting down with a single person and talking to them than I have from like 10,000 session recordings, right? I find that like, it depending on the situation, you may not need as many interviews as you think too, I found that like after about the 5th interview, I start to see some pretty obvious trends. So I think that statistically, I believe it's 12. I think that like after 12, you've pretty much established trends that you'd see if you went and interviewed 100 people. So yeah, I find that like it doesn't take too much as long as you're just getting good quality data and research to work off of. So.
I feel like this is an area too, where just in like today's day and age, like, with we talked about the quantitative data and things like that. It's almost easier to sit behind your computer and just look at numbers and stuff like that. And it's amazing how picking up the phone and making a call to a customer, or hopping on a Zoom with a customer or something can maybe be the best thing you can do on the research side. And it's kind of resonates with me as like at the end of the day, what we're building are products used by humans, and so like it's a more human way to get to know the people using it by like actually talking to them, asking them questions, being curious and digging in with them. So it's just, that really resonates with me on just like maybe a counterintuitive in today's day and age approach, but like also very obvious when you really think about it. So
yeah, totally. I do find that like the one place where I think quantity matters is the amount of data you have on a single person. If you have like a more complete profile on a person, that makes that like interviewing process and everything else just more complete. A lot of times I find that, we focus in on a journey and we say, okay, like, let's go interview some people that have gone this journey. A lot of times we're like, oh, we can't, like, we don't have the data for that. Like we don't know exactly who we should be interviewing here. So I do find that like having a lot of data in like a CRM, like Salesforce, and like having that aggregated together to like get a very clear picture of a person is pretty critical. And I find that that's more valuable than making sure you have a ton of like data in Google Analytics, so.
Yeah, it's like about how to, the more data you can have on a specific person, then you start to see that story, that human story of like that person, right? And obviously if you can layer that in with conversation as well, you can really start to understand your customer. So yeah, that resonates with me for sure.
Yeah, totally. So we've kind of worked through the process here, right? Like we've said, we've got our objective, we identified our journey, we had our opportunities. Tip 4, don't rely on just internal feedback. Go and interview people, get your data, get good quality data, good interviews. You've identified your opportunities, you put them in place, just keep going. Like, there's a reason why Amazon still runs a ton of A/B tests, right? Amazon's been around for 15 years and they still aggressively A/B test because it should never stop, because there's always opportunities down the road. These don't have to be like big iterations, but what I've typically seen is, people will come up with an idea, and I've fallen for this before. And you come up with an idea, you think it's a home run, you spend a lot of time on it, you go to implement it. I think you kind of mentioned the example, Ryan, and you launch it and it doesn't work as well. Your conversions go down, right? Or the customer experience, the CSAT score goes down. You're like, oh my gosh, what a total waste, and you just scrap it. Don't do that. Sometimes you have to iterate yourself to the best solution. And they could just be small iterations, right? Like, oh, like we put that there, for your example, we put the add to cart down there. Let's just move it up a little bit. And sometimes you'll just unlock something that you just didn't see originally.
Amazing how big of an impact that change made. Honestly, it was like it was crazy that moving that above the fold was hands down the biggest effect. And then all the other page changes we had made started to like, move our conversion rate. We actually ended up doubling from the prior website, but before we doubled, we went down because of that error that we made. Just kind of interesting. Yeah, I totally am with you on this.
Yeah. And if you have, a lot of times, if you have a decent amount of traffic and you have a test you want to run that you think is like kind of risky, you could maybe just send 20% of people to your iteration, your test variant, and then send 80% to what you have today. Always do an A/B test, right? That's critical, and we can talk about that more. But yeah, I find that like plan to have a test after your test because you're going to work into it, right? And sometimes they may not work, and you need to make sure you're measuring and watching that, right? I have had times where we've implemented a solution and said, see ya, that'll do good. And then you just leave it and you go elsewhere, right? You got a lot going on. And then you come back and measure it like 6 months later and you're like, oh no, that didn't work, right? So just, you got to stay on top of it a bit and just make sure that like you're measuring, and anything you implement, you need to make sure you can measure, right? Like if you're doing something around experience to like increase retention, make sure that you're shooting out like an NPS or CSAT survey right after it, just to make sure that you can measure what you're putting in place. So,
yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So those are my like 6 tips. And I think that they kind of led us through this, but we've iterated on this quite a bit. And, typically when a client comes to us and says, hey, I want to, kick off our optimization program, or we've been trying to optimize, but it's just not working as well as we'd hoped. This is typically the framework we'll take someone through. Now, this can move around a bit depending on the situation, but I typically see it falling into like these 4 buckets. And 1 and 2 are very kind of interchangeable here, but typically what I see is, a customer comes to us and says, hey, like, we want to optimize. My first question is, what do you want to optimize? Like, what do you care about? What does your business care about? Once we identify that, we typically go into like, all right, like, let's find your journeys that are most important to this, right? And once we find those journeys, I typically will do like an internal like journey mapping exercise. Say, okay, let's go through and map out every step in this. I like to do like a sentiment chart after that and say like, are you happy at this point? Or are you upset, right? And we'll typically go through that. And then we identify opportunities from that. We say like, oh, people are probably pretty upset here. Like, what are our opportunities here? And I like to do this with sticky notes, and we have like 100 sticky notes on the board. And then typically what we'll do is then just go like research and investigate. Like, we think these are our opportunities. Let's look at our data. And sometimes the data comes before the journey mapping, that kind of moves around a bit. But then you just go and like confirm your opportunities through data, through interviews. And then you kind of come back together and say, okay, like, this maybe isn't an issue like we thought it was based on these 3 interviews. Let's take that off the board. This one definitely seemed like an issue for people. Let's move that up. And then you get to ideate and plan. So you have like a list of opportunities. We'll typically do a prioritization exercise and say like, let's see if we can surface like 5 here that we think are going to have the biggest impact. One framework that works here is called RICE. And then once you've identified those opportunities, figure out what your solution is going to be to test, right? And then we just build that iteration, always A/B testing or multivariate testing. So it could be A, B, C, D, but we're always testing it against our controls, and we're making sure that we have good data before we start the test. If you start a test and you can't trust your data before the test, how are you going to know which one won, right? You're not. So make sure your data is in place. We run tests, which build, iterate, and test. And then we're just continuously coming up with hypotheses, testing, and going from there. It all kind of comes down to that hypothesis. I think that I tend to be like pretty strict with how I structure a hypothesis. I think that keeps everyone in line. It makes sure that we're all, focused in on the same thing. There's a lot of different frameworks for hypothesis. Typically what I see is, if we do this thing, this will happen because of this. We pretty much strictly like will write our hypotheses like that, just so we're staying aligned on that. But then once we test, we'll come up with another hypothesis. In your case, we think that the button being down on the page is decreasing conversions, or I guess it would be
not a good move.
We think by moving the button up the page, people will check out more frequently because they see it above the fold. Something like that, right? So that's like typically how it flows. I do find a lot of times there's some work up front to get data in place, because what'll happen is we'll do our objectives, we'll identify our opportunities from journey mapping, then we'll go in to confirm those opportunities, and the data is just not there. We see that a lot. So there's like a data audit of sorts that we have to do. Say, okay, like, we can't really like confirm these things. Let's go like get some more data. Interviewing people, talking to customer service, whatever it may be. So sometimes getting through 1 and 2 takes a bit of lifting, but once you're there and you have data you can trust, you can move pretty quick once you have that in place. So,
yeah, and this all definitely resonates with me. And it just got me thinking about, as you're talking about, like, as you start to figure out, which of these potential journeys you focus on, and you start to look at, like, based on the hypotheses, what could the impact be? One thing we see a lot at LaunchPad is, folks coming to us with, they might think that their website's not like optimized. And a lot of times it has to do with both from a traffic acquisition, how do we get more traffic to the site, but also from a conversion optimization of how do we make sure for everyone landing in, we're optimizing those folks' journey to converting, whether it be buying a product, signing up, or just reaching out, or whatever that conversion journey is. One thing I find really helpful, because a lot of times when you're talking about a holistic rebuild, like rebuilding a whole website or conversion funnel, the project can get kind of expensive, right? As you think about the level of effort that needs to go into that process. I find the ROI tends to be something that like you can really kind of calculate in a sense. If you do have a hypothesis and you've clearly laid out, we think we can maybe pop our conversion rate by 20% if we do these things, if we redesign the website in this manner. And if you understand your traffic, if you understand your average order value, you can really like compute, well, how much are we gonna, if it costs us X to make this new thing, you can kind of compute, well, how much is that going to return to the business? I mean, Brett, from your experience, like as you talk about like maybe getting other stakeholders in the business bought into one of these optimization experiments or projects, any tips and tricks on getting folks bought in on a larger kind of holistic, project that might entail some investment beyond just like tweaking where a button goes and things like that?
Yeah. Easiest to get buy-in once you start making them more money. Seriously, especially if you're in like the marketing world. It's a bit different if you're trying to increase like a CSAT score or something, right? But yeah,
start small, kind of like start with something that you can deliver some value, or
yeah. I mean, definitely surface your opportunities that like are maybe the easiest effort, biggest impact, and that's what like a prioritization like Rice will do for you.
Totally.
But yeah, like I find like your point about ROI is like a really good one. And a lot of times within a hypothesis, I like to put numbers in there and say like, we think by doing this thing, we're going to increase conversions by 20%. I mean, you're totally guessing, but what that implies is that you have an objective in mind and you're going to measure it, right? Like you can't confirm that hypothesis unless you go measure it. Right. So if that's baked in to the original statement of what you're doing, you can go measure that. Now, be careful about what you commit to there. And everyone needs to understand that that's a hypothesis, not a guarantee, right? But if you go do that and you're measuring and you're improving, and those are objectives that people truly care about, buy-in shouldn't be that hard. Two biggest things I see for people not getting buy-in. One, you're focusing in the wrong area. You're trying to improve, NPS score when all the executives care about is bringing more people in the door.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard to get, more money to do that. Two is not adequately measuring your impact. If you can't justify how much business you're bringing to the company, somebody else is going to raise their hand and be like, nope, that was me. We did this thing. Yeah. Give me the money, give me the budget for next year. Right. So you need to make sure that like when you're implementing solutions, testing and iterating, that you have a very clear strategy for how you're going to measure that and when you're going to measure it. Maybe it's a note on your calendar that says, go measure this thing in a month from now. Right. And make sure you have the tools to do that.
And promote it upstream, right? Like show the rest of the business, like what you did, celebrate those wins. And so you can go get that next budget or project that you think could move the needle for the business. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
All right. Should we jump into this?
Yeah. I like this.
All right. So basically, what we want to do is kind of do a hypothetical example. I want Brett to kind of walk through a hypothetical example here. So imagine that I am, the chief product officer at an insurance company. And I think there's an opportunity on the optimization side. Maybe leadership is really looking at, how do we optimize, a certain process, maybe it could be conversions, maybe referrals. I guess like Brett, if I'm in those shoes as a CPO of an insurance company, like how do I approach this? How do I jump in?
Yeah. And that's commonly the situation when you see people come in at. It's like, we want to get more juice from the squeeze, right? Like, we built these things, but they're not doing as much as we'd hoped, right? Like, that's pretty common. First thing I'm going to ask you is, what really matters to your company? Like, what do you have a North Star metric? I really love the concept of North Star metric. It's like this one big thing. You see companies like Spotify do this, where it's like, ultimately, if we can focus on one thing, it's this, right? Like, I'll be trying to like dig into your company and your business to understand what that thing is. Because I don't want to go out and build something for you that's not going to immediately impact your business and make your business more successful. So yeah, that'd be my first thing, is like, help me understand your business. Like, what do you guys have a dashboard where you report your metrics every month in an executive meeting? Let me see that. Like, let me see what people are really looking at, right? And you'll see things there like, cost per acquisition of a customer, right? Like on the marketing end. You'll see things like lifetime value, retention, these type of things start surfacing a bit more there. So that's really step one. So I guess for this example, let's narrow in on one of those and just hypothetically walk through a situation. I think we have referrals here. I'm happy to walk through that. If you want to spin it up and do something different and put me on the spot, we can do that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think referrals. Let's go through that.
That's a good one. Because referrals are kind of tricky.
Comes up a lot. I've seen this. I've had many clients come to us with, I'm trying to drive more referrals, and that be, kind of a goal. I mean, it's an indicator that clients are really happy. There's a lot that falls into that, but it's also a huge growth opportunity, especially for like, areas where there's a lot of passion. Like I had a client in the solar space where, a lot of people are passionate about going green and stuff like that. And referrals were a big part of their business. So anyway, yeah, I think this is a good example. Let's dig into it.
Cool. Yeah. So let's say we go through that exercise and we say, okay, referrals is like the key thing we're going to focus in on here. What I'm going to do next is start to itemize a list of all the journeys that someone could go on at your company. And then I'm going to start thinking through, of those journeys, what could have the biggest impact on referrals. Commonly what I see with referrals is it'll typically happen towards the start of a customer's life cycle. So when they first make that decision, if they feel good about that decision, they want to share that with people. Be like, hey, like, I made this really good decision. I saved this much money. I got this cool thing. You should do it too, right? Like that's a very common thing I see. Another time would be, as they're a customer, like those big moments when they're a customer. We're using insurance here. Let's say it's auto insurance. That first wreck I get into, like once I get rear-ended or I rear-end someone, from that point on to when my car gets fixed, that could be a really important journey to focus on for referrals, because that could determine my sentiment towards your company. And my sentiment has to be high. I have to really be excited about your company to refer you to my family member, right? So it's like those big impact things. So, we'd have this big list. We'd say one journey is reporting an accident or reporting my first claim. Let's call it that. Let's focus in there. So let's say we think that the journey of reporting my first claim could have the biggest impact to referrals. And what we do is we just journey map that. From sticky note of, ouch, I got rear-ended, to sticky note of, look at my car, it's all fixed, right? And we just start like going through that and saying, okay, like what point here is, are they going to be upset? Are they going to be happy, right? And we're going to start doing that. We'll start identifying opportunities. Something we may run into there is like immediately after the wreck, like maybe they feel confused, like they're not sure what to do, right? And we may identify some opportunities there to like make sure they're informed customers of like, or make sure they have a really easy to get to resource to understand exactly what to do that's going to walk them through like the first 5 minutes after I got rear-ended, right? And we may see like, oh, like a mobile app build here could be cool. That's a pretty big bet. Like maybe there's some smaller bets in there. But maybe that's what we think is going to really move the needle, is like, let's build a mobile app that's like quick, convenient. They open it up. They can quickly, make a claim. They can get the information they need. We can like really push our brand there of like, it's going to be okay. Like, we're here for you. right type thing, right?
Make it real easy for them to call and get support and those kind of things, right?
Yeah. So we may start to surface things like that. We may see, there could be obvious stuff like at no point are we asking for a referral. Once we do this great thing and we deliver this great customer service and their car gets fixed and they're happy, maybe we're not even asking for a referral, right? Like that could be an opportunity where we see like, well, we need to make sure that they're happy. But like, if we think they're happy at this point, like maybe we should be like, hey, mind like, referring us,
And I think if you think about that mobile app example here, claiming an account, if you get, or not claiming an account, sorry, creating a claim, and you go through that process and everything's resolved and you're like feeling this like burden off your shoulders, like, oh, I got my car back, everyone's fine, insurance took care of this. Like you just picture that push notification coming in on like, how did we do? Are you feeling better? Are you in a good space, and linking them right into an easy way where they can, put in, know anyone that might be interested in our company and, easily put in like, so, someone from your contact list on your phone or something. Like you can kind of see how that starts to translate to maybe an increase there.
Yeah, totally. So it's like, let's just make the assumption that we made this big bet that like a mobile app to handle the first 5 minutes of them putting in a claim. Like, let's say we focused in a mobile app build there. What I'd say is like, let's build it. And then we need to test it, right? Like, I don't want to immediately roll this out to 100% of customers because I'll have no way of knowing if this is a better experience than them picking up the phone and calling the number that's on their insurance card, right? So what we typically do is take a segmented group and roll that app out to them, whether it's like a test, it's probably like a closed test group in this case. And just let it be for a bit and just see how that goes. But make sure we can measure it, right? Like what I probably want to do is like make sure we're doing like a survey or something immediately after this experience in both cases, so we can make sure we can measure, or referrals, right? Like you could just measure how many people are referring people after this experience, right? And then we do that, and then we measure and test, right? And we'd say, oh, okay, like, yeah, our CSAT went up, but our referrals went down. And then we'd say, okay, let's iterate a bit and let's make a new hypothesis that says, we think that if we show them the referral link at this point, we're going to increase referrals, right? And then we iterate there. But we're always taking that journey approach. At no point are we going to like focus in on only that app and try to, at some point we may just try to optimize that app. But if we just get so focused there, we may miss this other thing that's down the road, right?
Yeah. And it reminds me of like, there's going to be touch points outside of the app, right? Like maybe that person calls in, they have some urgent issue. I had over the weekend, my heater wasn't working in my house, and I called this HVAC company, and they were like amazing. Like they moved pieces around so they could come out right away. They fixed it. And, I went from like my kids freezing their tails off at night, and I was like pretty concerned about it, to like the house was warm, and I was like, dodge that situation. It was because this HVAC company just really bent over backwards. And, they didn't ask me for a review or anything. I left a review. I was so happy about it. But like, that's a moment where like, even just looking at that, the nature of the request, like, oh, this is serious. Their heat is out, right? Like that's a serious problem for this customer. If we can fix that, if we can be timely about that, and then if we can ask them for, to help us out back after that, it seems like reasonable, right? And like, and a lot of people would take to that. So it's, having that information in your CRM on the nature of the request and the fact that it, was handled right away, and that they're satisfied coming off of that, could be a pretty good indicator that they're ready to leave a, review or to create a referral.
Yeah, totally. It's a good example. I think, so that's kind of the path I would go with this, this hypothetical company. And typically I like to just like establish like a strategy for them and like really implement some sort of program. Like, we're going to have like quarterly iterations of this or something, right? Like it's important to establish a frequency of things. So typically what I would do is say like, let's do this journey mapping exercise. Let's identify these opportunities. We're going to rank our opportunities, and we're going to figure out how much we can bite off, right? We're going to say we have this much budget for this quarter. Let's bite off this. Let's test it. Let's leave some time for iteration on those like 3 hypotheses. Let's say we identify 3 to go and build. Let's leave some time for iteration. But then in a quarter from now, let's go back and do a similar exercise. And let's go through it again and see if we change what changed at that point. And then we'll decide, oh, we want to continue to iterate on this hypothesis, or, maybe this new thing surfaced. It's important to establish those like rituals and that frequency. It's not a one and done thing. If you make it a one and done thing, you're going to leave opportunities on the table, or things that go unmeasured. So.
Yeah, you've got to be committed to the long game on this a little bit.
Yeah. So with this company, we'd probably end with a plan for the quarter. We'd go build it, right? And we'd be testing it. We'd be testing alongside them, right? We'd both be looking at the data. We'd be coming up with different ideas and iterations, and we'd be creating new hypotheses within that quarter. And then at some point, it's going to be clear, like, okay, let's go back to the drawing board, and we'll do another session. And eventually, what'll happen is, some of that starts to get instilled with the client, and they're going to start doing some of these things on their own. We may still be helping them build the solutions, but my ultimate goal is just to establish that culture and just have that optimization attitude and that idea that, like, we're going to test these things. That's so critical. So much of optimization is getting the culture of optimization in place than like actually like doing it.
And I can see how, like, if you think about all those different journeys that a customer can go through, and as you start to hit one and then you hit the next, and you're optimizing across all of these, and now the customer's like, conversion journey is enjoyable. And then suddenly they have this really great support experience, and this really easy, referral process. Like when you start to add it all up, then it starts to be, you move the needle in such a significant way where, now your increased conversion rate coming into a really great retention process. And like, before you know it, your business is just exploding, right? Because you've optimized all these different facets, but you've got to start with, I like how you're framing this, of you got to find the biggest impact things first to get more value to the business, to be able to then reinvest in that next one. Right. So I like the way you structured this.
Yeah, totally. Well, I just got pinged by Rebecca. We're running out of time here. Maybe we can, let's just skip ahead to the tech stack. We could go through this pretty quick, but I just wanted to show this of like some technology to consider. There's 100 different things out there, and you're going to find the right one for you. Here's some things we've used in the past. I think the thing to like focus on here is like, I find there's typically like 6 categories of tools is kind of how I see it. You have your analytics platform. Those are typically pretty obvious. One I may bring to the surface there that we use a lot is Mixpanel. The reason I like Mixpanel is it's manually created events. Google Analytics is all automatic. I find that with Google Analytics, your data can get pretty messy. And at that point, people start to not trust it. Being that Mixpanel is all manually created events, it becomes really trustworthy data and measures exactly what you need. So it's not as fuzzy around the edges. So we use that one a lot. Recordings and heat maps, we talked about that. Like spinning up crazy eggs, like super easy, and it's pretty affordable. User testing, usability hubs, great if you want to do some like, UX testing of sorts. Feedback surveys are great. You can have like the little pop-up comes on the website, give us some feedback on this page. I find response rates aren't great on those, but if you have enough people come to your website, you can get some data from that. Data aggregation is a pretty important aspect as you're thinking about journey optimization. That goes back to what we were talking about, Ryan, of like having data on like a profile of a person. I find that CRMs are sometimes a logical place to put a lot of that data. There's other things like segments that are built specifically for that.
And I'll just add on too with that is like a segment I've used for my e-commerce bunk bed business. And what we would do with it is we'd be able to send all this data into all the different like marketing platforms we use, Facebook, Pinterest, Bing, like all the different, and what was huge about that is like, a lot of times what you find is the optimization can be different based on who the customer is, right? So like, we found that it's a pretty different, conversion journey depending on like what someone is searching into Pinterest or Google, or potentially whether they're more interested in like whether they're more in the city versus like in the suburbs. So it's kind of interesting. You start to be able to, if you can get the data into the places where you're advertising, you can start to also optimize your advertising alongside your website and things like that. So just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, that's a good call out. Yeah. So that's like generally the tech stack that we're using for people. It's mix and match, but that's kind of what I've seen typically. So yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Should we go to questions?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you both for all those examples. That was really educational, and I personally enjoyed listening to it quite a bit. So with the time we have left, we can tackle a couple questions. The first one that came in, Brett, I think this would be suited for you pretty well. The question is, what is the ideal team structure to start optimizing?
Yeah, like starting an optimization program.
Mm-hmm.
Typically what I find is, you need that kind of lead person that's going to follow the test through, plan your builds. Typically I find like a product manager's a good fit there. Business analyst could be someone too. If you're trying to be a real small team, ideally you find a PM or BA that can look at your data too. A lot of times if you have a bigger team, you'll have like people that all their job is just looking at data, like a data analyst. So the typical structure I see is like a PM, BA, or, and then a data analyst, and then like your dev tech team to actually build solutions and test. I find that, if you're a smaller company, maybe you can just get away with a PM, and then you can come to someone like us and we can like actually build your tests and build the solutions there. That's kind of a way to go like a bit more nimble with it, being that you're kind of have these like one-off type builds. But yeah, that's typically what I've seen. If you get bigger and you're like enterprise level, obviously you have multiple teams working on different tests, but typical structures like PM, data analyst, devs, and designers. It's typically what I see. So
I think that leads into the next question pretty well, which is, when should you consider internal versus external resources for your optimization efforts?
I think a lot of that just depends on capacity, or maybe just like the success of what you've done so far. If you've tried optimization and it hasn't worked well, maybe it's time to get some outside help. I think it's a matter of like, what are your skill sets internally, and understanding where you may need to offset that. Typically what I've found is, based on the clients that we've done optimization with, is, they have a real strong leadership team. They may have a product person on board, and they may even have some dev resources, but they're so busy with like building new products that like finding time to like optimize your existing products like just doesn't happen. So I find a lot of times we come in and we collaborate with them and we kind of become their optimization wing, until, and typically I find there's like a natural trade-off at some point. Like eventually down the road, they get more resources that becomes part of their culture, and, we start to hand some things off. But we've had times where we just are a managed optimization wing of a company for a long time. So different flavors there, but it's just understanding your skill set, and just don't stretch yourself too thin. The thing that's going to kill your optimization program the quickest is people not having time to care about it or work on it, right? So if you're really serious about it, think about your capacity. It takes time. Building tests, iterating on them takes time. So yeah.
Fantastic. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So it looks like we'll give everyone a couple minutes back in their day, but thank you everyone for joining us. As a follow-up, I will send this recording out via email within the next couple of hours for you. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, I've placed Brett and Ryan's contact information here, which I'll also include in the follow-up email. So, with all that being said, thank you so much for tuning in, and enjoy the rest of your day.